Hey you guys, Maestro here, and I want to talk to you today about the best hip flexor stretch that you're probably not doing. I'm your host, Dr. Shanté Cofield, but you can just call me the Maestro. A little bit about me, and then we'll jump into the good stuff. I'm the founder of the Movement Maestro LLC. I live in beautiful sunny Southern California. I am a physical therapist by trade. I'm also a US-based rock tape instructor. I'm the host of Maestro on the Mic. I'd love to have you check out the podcast. And basically, my entire life now revolves around social media. So please slide into the DMs. My Instagram name is @themovementmaestro. I would love to chat with you. So let's talk about those hip flexors, okay? Take a look at these drawings here and meet your hip flexors. Now, the primary function of your hip flexors is, as the name states, to flex your hip. Now, these drawings come from that book in the corner there, The Role Model. That's from Jill Miller, really good friend of mine. I absolutely love her work. Definitely check her out, Yoga TuneUp on Instagram, tuneupfitness.com. Some of the props that I'm going to be using later on in this, they come from her company, TuneUp Fitness. So we see two of the major hip flexors here. Your psoas, which is going to start at your lumbar spine. It's going to attach to a bony prominence on your femur. And then we have our iliacus that goes from the inside of your hip here, right inside of your pelvis, and down to that same bony prominence. We kind of tie them together and we call them the iliopsoas, but it is two different muscles. But right now we're just going to talk about globally or grossly your hip flexors. Now, the number one complaint that I hear as a physical therapist, my hip flexors are tight. Everybody in the world telling me my hip flexors are tight. My response to them, pain and tightness are symptoms, not causes. You need to figure out why that thing is tight in the first place. Flip side of this, or the typical response that they give me is, oh, it's because I sit all day. Well, yes and no. Your hip flexors are not simply tight because you sit, right? You're not Gumby. It's not like, oh, I sat down and, oh gosh, now I'm stuck here forever, right? Because you do stand up and walk around. So what is the problem? Lack of movement and a subsequent loss of stability. So it's not that you're sitting in the chair, it's that you're sitting supported in the chair and never doing anything else. When we're sitting supported in a chair, it requires very little reflexive use of our core here, our core in our neck. So when we stand up, anything that requires our core, good luck. It is all, and I say it, movement, life is all about safety. Your nervous system is always seeking safety. Everything that it's going to do is to create safety. So if we think of the basic anatomy that we went over before about the hip flexors, right, they attach to your lumbar spine, right? One attachment points lumbar spine, one attachment is that bony prominence here. In the absence of appropriate reflexive control of your core, not necessarily strength, but reflexive control, your nervous system is going to say, you don't own this. You're not safe. Your back, your spine is not safe. So what will it do? It will reflexively make things tight to provide that stability. So we said that hip flexor attaches to the lumbar spine. If my nervous system says your lumbar spine doesn't seem safe, you don't have good control here, it will make the tissues around it really tight to provide that stability, to provide that control, to provide that safety. Therefore, for many people that complain about this tightness in their hip flexors, stability work, not stretching, is the answer. So what can you do? First and foremost, and I think you guys in the yoga world understand this, start with breathing. Breathing is going to allow for some general down regulation of your nervous system. If everything's like this, we can use breathing, to help communicate with that parasympathetic nervous system and calm things down, reflexively relax those hip flexors. From an anatomical perspective, there is a fascial connection between your psoas and your diaphragm. So if we actually start utilizing that diaphragm more, we will get some more excursion of that hip flexor, of that psoas. Lastly, breathing is the first way that we learn how to properly, reflexively pressurize the core. So we want to get back to those foundations to help set us up for success down the road. What else do we want to be doing? Well, we want to think about activating your hip flexors, right? We want to think about actively engaging your hip flexors. So I know the title said the best stretch that you're probably not doing because it's not actually a stretch. We're going to talk about being more active, imparting stability to this area so that your nervous system says, I feel safe, and now I will relax. So two things that I want to show you here. For this, all we're going to need is a small band, right? You call these mini bands, you can get them on Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive. If you don't have access to a band, I will show you how to do it with your hands. So my favorite way to go about doing this, we're going to get on the floor. And we're just going to get into that 90-90 position. So we'll be on our back here. And we'll get in that 90-90 position. Now, if you don't have access to a band, then we can just use our hands. And all we're going to do is we can bring both legs, if you'd like, into this tabletop position. I'm going to push that way with my hands while my hip flexors push this way. So I maintain this isometric contraction and maintain this position. I can start off nice and easy. You see, I'm still able to speak to you. This shouldn't be so aggressive that I have to hold my breath, right? We want to utilize the appropriate breathing strategy. If that's too much, I can regress it to just one single leg. Notice I'm still in that neutral position here, right? I haven't gone into this overarched position. I'm nice and centrated. I'm nice and stacked. I'm able to breathe. And I'm just going to look to activate those hip flexors while also providing some midline stability. Right? Same thing here. If I'm ready to progress, or I have access to a band, I'm just going to put the band around my feet. And I can go into that same position. And now I'm going to I'm going to maintain the same position here, utilizing those hip flexors as I straighten this leg out. So we see as I straighten that leg out, that band wants to pull my hip away. So I have to use those hip flexors. I have to activate those hip flexors. I have to have appropriate midline control here to maintain this position. You see, I'm still able to breathe. This shouldn't be a high threshold breath holding strategy. I can alternate. I can also look to bring my knees past 90 degrees, so I'm working throughout the entire range. And if from here you're unable to go all the way out without losing position, then just don't go so far out. The whole goal is I'm looking to impart a force via that band that forces me to utilize those hip flexors, right, to activate them, to get them to start contracting, wake them up, and also have my core engaged. The question that I always get from you guys, how many, how long? 3 sets of 1,000,000 for everyone. I typically say start off with feel, right? I want a quality movement pattern there. And then when we feel like we're starting to lose form, then we can take a break and revisit it. The next thing I want to show you, right, I'm going to give you a little bit more bang for your buck here because I tricked you and said that we were going to be working on stretches. The next one that I want to show you is active mobility work. So the first thing that we went over was how to quote unquote activate the hip flexors or recruit the hip flexors. The next thing that we can look to do is active mobility work. So for this, I like to use what's called the Cook hip lift. It was, I guess, invented by Gray Cook. And you can check him out, brilliant, brilliant guy. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to utilize principles of reciprocal inhibition. So we're going to go into this bridge, and that means we're going to be utilizing our glutes, which ideally helps decrease some of the tension that we may be feeling within the tissue in the front or our hip flexors. So to do this Cook hip lift, I'm going to use a Coregeous ball here. If you don't have access to one, that's fine. You can use a pillow. You can start by just using your hands. These drills are accessible by anyone. So we're going to get into that same position on the ground. What we're going to look to be doing ultimately is going to be a bridge, okay? But we're going to take it to the next level, and we're going to bring one leg in towards our chest. That's going to force our pelvis into relative flexion position, okay? So when we get to the top, we want to make sure that we're not super overarched or anything like that. We're going to bring that knee in towards your chest. You may have more mobility than me. That's fine. Bring it in. And then from here, all we're going to do is lift up as high as we can. All right? You see, I can't go terribly high. That's okay. You just go to what you can do. And then back down. When we're doing this, we are imparting safety and stability to the system. We're saying, I own this range. I can utilize these tissues. These can relax. If you want to use the Coregeous ball, right, it's just going to be a tactile cue here. We'll do the same thing, and we'll put the ball between our leg and our body there. This is going to force us to actively use the hip flexors on this side while we're doing some active mobility of the hip flexors on this side. And when we lift up, we want to make sure that we maintain that position, because if we lose it, we're going to lose the ball. So it becomes that tactile feedback that forces us to maintain that position, right? We're up. You may catch a cramp the first time you do this. You've been warned, okay? And back down. Major points here. You see I'm talking to you the whole time. We should be able to breathe. We shouldn't be overarching our back, and we want to make sure that we maintain position or maintain that position of that ball by keeping our hip flexor on this side engaged. Okay. Lastly, because I did talk about stretching, if you must stretch, let's make sure that you're doing it effectively. I'm not certain how many people in this audience truly need to be working on a stretch, but I really want to make sure if you do it, that you're doing it effectively and efficiently. So my favorite way to stretch the hip flexors is going to be in half kneel. Some points that I want you to think about with this is that we want to keep that core engaged. Proximal stability is going to allow for more distal mobility. The more contraction, appropriate contraction and stability or control I have here, the more likely my hip flexor then is to start acting as a hip flexor, not as a spinal stabilizer, so it'll relax. We can, and I will, hold on to something while you're doing this. That's going to provide that additional support, that additional stability, makes the nervous system feel safe, and therefore gives you more mobility. So for this, we're just going to get into that half kneel position. All right, so we're going to come down, and I'll show you from multiple angles, guys. We're going to get into that half kneel position. Right? The leg that you're stretching is going to be the one that's in the back. Okay? From here, I have an additional point of contact. I have my core braced. You can actually push down into that supporting surface. That will help turn this on more. Now, to get some of that stretch here, we don't want to just softly, unengaged, lean forward. We actually want to think about dragging this leg or this knee towards this foot. We're trying to decrease that space. We're going to squeeze the glute. That's going to look to turn us under as such. So we're nice and stacked. We're not in that super arched position. Right? And we should be able to feel from here a good stretch. Right? If you need to lean forward a little bit, you can, but just make sure we're not arching the back and losing position. Keep ourselves in this nice, tight position here. Use another point for stability, whether it's on this side, whatever your choice, so that you have that third point of contact. Keeps yourselves nice and upright, ribs are down, nice and centrated, and we're pulling here and squeezing that glute. We'll give you a nice stretch along the front side of that tissue. When you're done with that, right, that was a passive stretch, nothing wrong with that, but when you're done with that, we then must go and be active. All right, once we impart mobility to something, we have to say, hey, nervous system, I got this, we're safe. And we're going to impart stability by doing active movements. We just focused on, within this segment here, that feeling of tightness that you may have in your hip flexors. And after doing any of those three, you should definitely have a decrease in your symptoms. But perhaps you are a clunker, right? You go to put on your pants, or you're doing, Pilates V's, or you're doing dead bugs, bicycles, anything. You get that deep clunk in your hip. You too need stability. What? Yeah. If you experience that hip clunking, nothing is out. Your SI joint is not coming in and out, or anything like that. What's actually happening, and I'm going to use this as a little demo. Remember the anatomy there. We said that your hip flexor goes from your spine to that bony prominence on the inside of your leg. So what happens when you get that clunk is that this tissue, that hip flexor, is actually popping over a bony prominence on your pelvis. It's called the iliopectineal eminence. Why does this happen? Because you've been using your hip flexor as a spinal stabilizer instead of as a hip flexor. So if I go to lower my leg as such, right? If I go to lower my leg, ideally, this should be able to eccentrically lengthen and to allow me to be able to do that. When I don't have proper reflexive stability of my core, my nervous system is going to reflexively hold that hip flexor tight, which means when I go to lower that leg, it doesn't elongate, and it goes, and it pops right over that bony prominence. You guys have experienced it, I'm sure. It doesn't hurt, it just feels kind of weird. What's the solution? Not more stretching, right? We don't need to stretch it more. We need to give control to this area so that your hip flexor now feels safe enough to actually act as a hip flexor and eccentrically lengthen, right? Because your nervous system says, hey, my spine is actually safe. I don't need to reflexively tighten the tissues around it. You, hip flexor, can go and do your job and control or eccentrically control that hip extension. So, my friends, let's summarize. Tightness is a symptom, not a cause. Your tight hip flexors, I feel for you, but understand they are there for a reason. Typically because you've lost stability somewhere else, oftentimes in your midline or your core. Your nervous system will equate this lack of stability with a lack of safety, and therefore it responds by simply making things tight. So, to impart that safety, work on your stability, aka less stretching, more stabilizing. That's all I got for you guys. If you want more, please, you can hit me up via email, info@themovementmaestro.com. You can check me out on social media. I'd love to chat with you. You can check out my website. I got a ton of information there for you. If you enjoyed this and you want to learn more, check out my presentation, A Date with the Queen, improving your mobility, treating your pain, and owning your breathing. Head on over to Yoga International to hear from me and an absolutely incredible team of movement experts. I'll see you there.